Thank you for joining us for this Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves. I'm Program Officer in the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library. I'm being joined today by Dr. Sara Wermiel, an independent scholar, historian of technology, and historic preservation consultant. And Sara has researched and written widely on business history and historical buildings and their technologies. Sara has conducted significant research in numerous Hagley collections, including for her recent project, An Introduction of the Rolled I-Beam in the United States of America in the 1850s, Revisited, in support of which Dr. Wermiel received a Henry Belin du Pont research grant from the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society. Sara, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. Pleased to be here.
Yeah, well, what is your project about?
So the rolled I-beam is what's called a structural section, and it's a piece of metal that was initially rolled in wrought iron and now is more, better known as steel. Wrought iron is scarcely used any longer. And it's in the shape of a capital I. And I can show you.
Oh, sure.
So this was originally rolled to replace wood in buildings to make them fire resistive. Mm-hmm. And this is a surprising fact that is kind of hard to get people to grasp, because it seems like, well, rolled metal structure, that's such a good idea. It's strong, why wouldn't people do that? But the reason why they did do it initially was to build what were called fireproof buildings. So there is a literature, so this section, this I section, was the first solid, as it's called, because it was rolled in one piece of structural metal that was made. It was sort of started the the route for structural metal frames, which eventually led to skyscrapers, which is one of the reasons why people are interested in the history of this structural metal. And so there is a literature on the beginnings of rolling of I-beams. It's rather old. Some of the articles were written, a few decades ago. And just in the course of my research on the history of fireproof buildings, I got into this, and then I saw it was probably worthwhile to focus on this literature and updating it specifically, so so that there's sort of more up-to-date information that scholars can use if they're interested in that. And so that's what I did in my article.
Where was this I-beam first developed, this technology?
So I should say that metal structural beams were used before the rolled I-beam. So again, the first rolled I-beams were in wrought iron. Prior to that, beams in an I shape were made of cast iron, and that was already, in the early 19th century. So there was a tradition of using metal beams, but so this was before rolling. And then also before solid beams could be rolled, what were called fabricated girders. So these were girders that were made out of flat pieces of metal and angle iron, and they were put together with rivets. And in fact, on the Hagley property, the small iron bridge that crosses the Brandywine, that's between roughly the Henry Clay Mill and the library and soda house area, on the road along the Brandywine, there's a small metal bridge, and everyone should look at it because it has very nice example of plate girders. So these are fabricated girders. The bridge, I think, was from the 1870s. So you can see very clearly on this nicely preserved bridge the plates at the top and bottom, and then the little angles and the rivets. So that was done before solid rolled I-beams, and continued to be done to make girders that were larger than could be rolled in solid pieces. But for fireproof floors, where you did not need a particularly deep girder, and the cost of making the fabricated ones was high naturally because you had the extra labor, and actually cast iron by the 1850s was, well, it was viewed rather skeptically, increasingly, because it was considered brittle, and in fact, it is not strong in tension. So people wanted wrought iron. So, so two companies actually in the mid-Atlantic area, Trenton Ironworks and Phoenix Ironworks, both in the early 1850s, started a project to try to roll solid beams, these I-beams, for buildings. And that's what I document in my paper. That's really the research question was, you know, it sort of boils down to who was first, Trenton or Phoenix. So they both, I can see in the early 1850s, they're both trying to do this, and it's a neck and neck race. And one of the difficulties in getting definite information is that Phoenix's records from this period, surviving business records, are not very complete. Well, they're very sparse. So there were just a few clues, and even secondary information is doesn't really, you know, give a definite answer. But the Phoenix records at Hagley were wonderful, and I went through everything I could find. Again, not much surviving from this important period, sort of 1850 to 1856, except for one very critical letter, which, you know, sort of the whole case hinges on this letter, pretty much, these two letters.
Tell us about the letter.
Well, so Trenton Ironworks, obviously in Trenton, and this company was set up by Peter Cooper, his son, and what became his son-in-law, Abram Hewitt. But it was managed by Cooper's son, Edward, and Abram Hewitt. And it began in Trenton about 1848. And they started their project to make beams in the early 1850s. Phoenix Ironworks has a longer history, but it became owned, it was bought by the Reeves family, and initially it was making nails and, you know, things of the early 19th century. When rolling of railroad rails began in the late 1840s, the firm went big into rails, and it was one of the first contractors to roll rails for the Pennsylvania Railroad, which began construction in 1847. So around that time, they are rolling rails. Meanwhile, Cooper and Hewitt are rolling rails. About 1850, there's a huge depression in the iron manufacturing business. England is dumping rails on the US market, and many mills go out of business. And so I think that Trenton and Phoenix, in turning to beams, they were looking for a product that would not have as much competition, and that was a new market, fireproof buildings. So cities are, you know, growing, taller buildings are being built, obviously nothing particularly tall, circa 1850, you know, maybe 5-6 stories at the most, but anyway, tall wasn't so much the issue. Fire protection was the issue, no matter how tall you were. So these were city buildings, banks, insurance offices, government buildings in particular, really a lot of government buildings that the owners did not want to burn down, wanted to protect. So they wanted structural metal to substitute for wood in the internal construction of the building. So both Phoenix and Trenton were very well capitalized. They were very, so to speak, rich companies. They developed their own rolling technology to make these beams. And I hope you can edit this, but I think I lost the track of what you asked.
Oh, it's quite all right. Well, you're going to tell me who came first.
Who came first?
Trenton or Phoenix, and they're sort of neck and
letter.
neck.
Yes, the letter. Okay.
And
so,
yes, correct.
The letter. So the liter, if I could, continue, the literature focuses on Trenton because business records of Trenton survive miraculously. And that, I think, I'm not positive, but it may be because of Peter Cooper's involvement, Abram Hewitt, they were very prominent people. Now the Reeves family that owned Phoenix Ironworks, later, eventually Phoenix Steel Corporation, a very long-lived company, but they were not as politically active, they weren't nationally prominent. I don't know if that's why their records don't survive, but for example, the records for Trenton Ironworks are in both the Library of Congress and the New York Historical Society. Anyway, so researchers looking at the history of the IBeam had a very good source of information, Trenton, and moreover, there are contemporary references that Trenton was the first. Meanwhile, there are secondary references that say Phoenix was the first, but the evidence isn't as good because it just, the records, as I say, from this period didn't survive. So, so there was this, both, seem to be in competition. Anyway, I particularly focused on Phoenix because that story wasn't told as well. So this letter, these two critical letters are between Trenton Ironworks and Phoenix Ironworks, the principals of the company. And they are from the early 1857. And Cooper and Hewitt of Trenton write to the Reeves family and say, listen, this is a new product, this IB. Why would we compete against each other? I hear that you have underbid us for these two projects. One was the Philadelphia Railroad Company headquarters. Why we should work out a deal, divide up the market. We shouldn't be competing on price against each other in this very small market. And we don't have the Reeves's response, but actually Cooper and Hewitt, the tone of their letter was very annoyed, that they had to compete with Phoenix for, on price for this. So what happened was Phoenix did get the Philadelphia Railroad Company headquarters building, and Trenton got some work too. And Trenton, moreover, had an almost exclusive deal with the federal government to build federal buildings. So not only do we have the records for them, those that survived the New York Historical Society and Library of Congress, but we have all the federal records, which are excellent for all these buildings for which they supplied beams. So I can tell you dozens of buildings that Trenton supplied beams for, most of which were federal government buildings. Again, it's very hard to find the buildings that Phoenix worked on. At any rate, we know from these letters that the bids for that Phoenix and Trenton bid against each other for these buildings in late 1856. So for sure, beams, both companies were rolling beams by then. In tracing Trenton, I can see that they finally, because you can get a pretty good timeline, finally they had a 9-inch I-beam, and that's this one, available by summer of 1856. I don't have that kind of confirmation for Phoenix, except that we know they did have beams by presumably late 1856. So as one sort of contemporary writer wrote about this, Trenton says, they had it, the hour before Phoenix did, or something to that effect. So it was really about the same time. However, what is important is that Phoenix actually had a better technology at an earlier date, and it unfortunately lost out on these government contracts. So it didn't have the kind of steady customer that Trenton had at an early date. It was really bidding for building projects. Again, unfortunately, we don't know, I don't know all the projects. It was hard to find the ones that I could. And they were competing even in Philadelphia with Trenton. So, I noted in my paper, the Cornelius and Baker lamp factory, that Trenton won that contract. That was a very large building with a lot of beams. Anyway, so it's not as if Phoenix had the market of Philadelphia even exclusively. But Phoenix started rolling 12-inch beams before Trenton did. It had a patent for a rolling process that was superior to what Trenton had. So it was early making a wider range of sizes and weights of beams for the market than Trenton was.
What were the market conditions pressuring the adoption of fireproof building techniques? Was it just the desire to have a safer investment in your capital, or perhaps were there insurance requirements that meant you had to satisfy a certain level of fireproofing?
It was all voluntary.
Oh, wow.
The only, so the federal government in the early 1850s adopted a policy to build everything but their, most small and kind of remote buildings, like on the frontier, to build those fireproof. So the federal government was an early and large customer, and that benefited Trenton. By the 1860s, fireproof buildings for private customers was growing, but the buildings were much more expensive. And again, the system had no benefit other than non-combustibility. A fireproof building and a regular building, they looked the same. It's not that you could build taller or that you need, they were in a sense overbuilt. The floors were typically made with iron beams and brick floors, and it was just more than was needed, except that an iron beam and a brick floor was fire resistant. So the customers, so the demand was slow but steady, and the customers were, again, like insurance companies, banks, libraries, maybe universities, kind of institutional and high capitalized private companies that were building headquarters. Those were the private customers, by and large. And then city and state government built this way. But contrary to what you might think, industrial buildings did not. So the Cornelius and Baker factory was a very rare example of a fireproof industrial building. It was just too costly. So industrial customers either went without or used other techniques for controlling fire, more affordable techniques. But insurance companies were completely uninterested. And I know this because I've written about it. It was, it's a sort of go-to thought, like, oh, well, don't insurance companies want buildings not to burn? In fact, they don't. They want buildings to pay premiums sufficient to cover the cost of buildings, whatever that might be. So burn or not burn, just as long as they can charge a sufficient amount to cover losses. That was really their strategy for a very long time, certainly all through the 19th century, except for some specialized companies that insured industrial buildings, some mutual companies, but the large private stock insurance companies had no rules. If you seem riskier, they just charged you more. And that turned out to be for most owners, the way to go. Only, as I say, owners that really, had a library, had, things that they just didn't want to burn. At their option, built fireproof.
So it was less about...
It changed eventually, by the 1880s, this began to change. But, initially as the IBeam is being developed, that was the situation.
So it's less about protecting the building than by protecting what's inside it.
Well, right. Except I should note, not the people. That was sort of off people's radar at the time. They thought if the building was fireproof, the people were okay. But there wasn't, which is not the case, but anyway, but there wasn't a lot of concern for a long time for safety to life. That really, sort of evolved as a separate track. The evolution of the fireproof building, which I cover in my book of the title, The Fireproof Building, was going in a different track. And there was just a general feeling that if the building was safe, the contents were safe, including the people, although there wasn't a lot of thought to the problem of how, if like the contents, could still burn in a fireproof building, and what do the people do? How do they get out? A lot of the concern was general conflagration and protecting the building from the outside from fire, and then having no wood structurally inside, and therefore different floors could be what's called today compartmentalized. So if it was all wood, it could burn through, but if you have a barrier, of brick and iron, that would stop the fire in a particular place, so you wouldn't have a general burn through a building. So that was a thought at the time. But it is true that beginning in the 1880s, a number of cities began to require certain kinds of buildings, certain tall buildings, eventually theaters, certain kinds of buildings to be fireproof. But the general mass of buildings, it was at the option of the owner.
Sort of a more general question, what is it like conducting research at the Hagley Library?
Oh, it's a dream. It's like, I don't know, going to paradise. You know, it's uh, the collections are wonderful. You know, you can never see everything you want to see. There's both, you know, manuscript and in-print collections. And I haven't used the visual collections much, but they're there too. You know, the Soda House for doing manuscript research is just great. And, you know, the staff is, you know, helpful, knowledgeable. And if I come, I try to also come when there's a Saturday opening. So one Saturday a month, you know, back in the pre-COVID days, the library's open, and I could even have manuscript material brought to the reading room of the main library to use that day. So if I'm doing a research trip, I stay on the grounds, and the grounds are, it's like the peaceful kingdom. There are all these little animals, there's deer, and I forget what you call them there, the sort of groundhogs. Do you call them? Yeah, I guess groundhogs on the property, and it's just wonderful. And you know, walking through the grounds is wonderful. So it's just really a wonderful place to do research. I feel very privileged to have been able to work there as many times as I have. Yes, and I've used the collections for many, many projects. And even on this one, besides the Phoenix Steel Corporation manuscript, you know, one of the early, well, for Trenton Ironworks, before rolling a proper eye, you know, symmetrical eye section, they first rolled something in this shape, which is a legitimate section that's used in ships. It's called a deck beam, but they rolled it for the Camden and Amboy Railroad. So this was, you know, it's referred to, you know, people call it a rail beam, but in fact, it was a rail. Camden and Amboy had an idea that if they made a very tall, very heavy rail, that it would last longer. That didn't turn out, but it's 7 inches tall. And for your information, this is a section of an actual contemporary rail. So this is more than 7 inches. But anyway, this is what a normal rail of the time would look like. So this was a very tall rail, and Trenton Ironworks made the rolls to roll this. Well, so there's a question of what happened to these rails. At first, when Trenton was having difficulty making a symmetrical eye, it began to ship this structural section instead of eyes. And in fact, it works as a beam. So that was what predated the rolling of eyes. And there is a question, well, what were they just like taking the rails from the Camden and Amboy Railroad? What was going on? So there are Camden and Amboy Railroad, I believe, there's some material about that in the Hagley collections too. This was imprint material. That was, it's still, I don't think I got quite to the bottom of that story, but for sure that was rolled for the railroad. It was put in place. Many rails were of that type were used, and eventually they were removed, but there's some disagreement. Abram Hewitt says they were in service for 50 years. There's other evidence that they might have been taken up sooner. But anyway, so these did exist. They were shipped to companies, I'm sorry, to construction projects prior to the eye. Phoenix only, was going for an eye and only had an eye. It eventually made deck beams too, proper deck beams. Again, those were used in ships for ship decks, but it didn't have this intervening period the way Trenton did.
It's fascinating teasing these mysteries apart.
Yes, well, that's, again, one of the wonderful things, if you're working on something, a kind of mid-Atlantic subject, the Hagley Library, between the imprints and manuscripts, there's just a ton. Yeah, I also used the, Pennsylvania Railroad, records just to confirm certain things for this project. So there's a lot of overlap, and it's great. It's all there, and you can get it fast. Unlike in some libraries where there are certain hours where they do polls at Hagley, it's right away. So everything is right on site. That's not the case in like the Library of Congress. Sometimes things are not right there. So it's really convenient. It's really great.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me, Sara.
Welcome.
And for the audience, if you'd like more information about Hagley History Hangouts or the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, and our research, grant, and fellowship programs, visit us online at hagley.org. That's hagley.org. And thank you once again, Sara.
Bye.